So David, having watched us for a few days, decided that the right thing to do was to just be himself. So that's what we've got. It is with great pleasure that I present David Chandler.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for inviting me. I've really had a really interesting few days. I hope I've learned something. I was definitely taking notes and listening. So whether I learned anything or not, maybe you'll be better judges than me. And the title of my presentation is about resilience and ethics and how to say something of interest to the audience about those things, and whether it is or how it might be related to whatever cybernetics is. So I took a leaf out of Philip's book when he was talking about teaching yesterday morning about the nature of learning as a conversation, and so I want to give my presentation, I guess, in terms of a conversation with some of the conversations I've been in or been listening to over the last few days. And I wasn't able to be in or listen to all of those conversations, so it's just a selection, I guess. And I'm also thinking that maybe coming over here, engaging in these conversations, you, the audience, might be able to help me as well, because one thing I'm not going to say that I know anything about is cybernetics, whatever that is, whatever order it might be in. But however, personally, I'm sort of convinced, for some reason that I'm not sure about, that whatever resilience is, and however it works, or the different ways in which it works, and whether it's a thing or a methodology, whatever, I'm sure it has to have something to do with cybernetics. I'm sure that both of these words or concepts or terms are to do with processes, about how we understand the world in less fixed and linear and separated ways, and how we understand ourselves in that world and the problems of that world in relationship to us processually. And I think whether resilience stands or fails in whichever way it might do, might also be related to whatever we think cybernetics might be or might offer to the world that we live in today. So I'm sure there's a relationship, but you people are like super cybernetics experts and everyone's disagreeing with everyone else, and it's this, it's that, the observer there, blah, blah. So I am not going to offer that, but I would really be happy. I'm going to present some different ideas about how people see resilience, and maybe you can help me and say, well, cybernetics really helps us say this, or do this, or if we were thinking of resilience like that, then this way of thinking would really be useful for you. So that's all I'm really doing here, and that's why I don't really have a big I never have presentations anyway, but that's one of the reasons I'm saying that I don't really have a pre-prepared presentation like that I'm just reading off, and I'm really lucky that, as I said, I had a few days. Okay, so those things being said, I think, so I'm going to say, I guess, I'm going to say 5 different resiliences, 5 ways in which resilience might be thought. Before I do that, though, I think I should say something about my own methodology, my own positionality as an academic. Even though that our session today is built on, what's the title of today? Action, practicing something. Each day has a title on top of it. Anyway, I'm not a practicing resiliencer. I don't go out and bring resilience into the world or tell people how to do resilience. I just think about how we think about resilience. And in that way, that may be helpful for people that are thinking about resilience. Often it's the opposite of what they want to hear or whatever. So what I'm thinking is that when we're thinking about resilience, there's also like a certain resiliency or cybernetic-y, processy way of reflecting upon those things as well. So in terms of what Paul was saying about how different frameworks have different languages, or what Klaus was telling us about discourses within discourses, maybe my presentation is sort of what language can we have to think about the languages of resilience, or what discourse about the discourses of resilience. That's sort of a meta level where I'm unfolding a process where different resiliences might unfold. So I'm not doing it in a literal, can't imagine what it would be to do it like that literally. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about my own positionality in relationship to it. I'm just an observer of observers, observing other observers in an endless chain of observations, the way that I see it. So the next thing I wanted to say is, in terms of how we might think about different ways of thinking about resilience, I wanted to think of 3 general ways. And maybe thinking about Hille's presentation, and a few other people as well, on Holling's adaptive cycle, which maybe some of us are familiar with. It's one way of thinking about resilience in ecology. But there's that loop, this adaptive cycle loop. And if I'd known I was going to do this, if I had an overhead presentation, I'd reproduce one of those loops with a forward-going, stabilizing, happy, clappy, everything going well, crisis, reorganization, starting again, one of those things. And so if I'd had a PowerPoint, I might have had 3 of those loops. 3 of those loops, not in a Holling-type way of representing a reality of real ecosystems or nested panarchy of different systems feeding into each other, but just about how we might think about the coherence of ideas, the language of languages. And the first loop might be a loop of modernist thinking, or linear thinking, or Enlightenment thinking. So this is it's tricky, and that's why I have to just do it rather than just present it, because otherwise it'd be more tricky. So I want to do 3 loops, and I want to argue that there's a resilience connected with that modernist way of thinking. And I think most of our discussions about resilience are in a fairly linear, forward-looking, progress, sciencey way of doing it, although it's a bit more touchy-feely, more engaging, more conversations, but generally it's like a forward-looking approach. The other 4 resiliences, I want to argue, are very different. I'm just presenting what my presentation is, so you're more than welcome to interrupt me and ask questions. Let me give you like the map of what my presentation is. So, and then there's a second loop of a different type of resilience, which isn't modernist. And in that loop, we have bounce-back resilience. This is what I'm calling first resilience, progress resilience. In the first loop, the loop of modernist thinking, whatever that is, just bear with me here. The second loop is a loop where we're not separated from the world. We're increasingly realize that we're embedded. Maybe the first loop is John's loop, the resilience progress loop, the modernist loop. The second loop is the pillar loop, the loop where we're embedded within the world. We're not separate. There's something about this embeddedness that enables us to think processually about processes that we're embedded within. Whatever that means. I would argue means something totally different from the first loop, where we're separate and scientific and learning and progressing. However, the pillar loop, the more we realize about our embeddedness within these processes, the better it is. It's a very sort of subject-centered loop that we become increasingly not in a solipsistic, not necessarily in a solipsistic way, but the world increasingly becomes about us. It's raining, there's an extreme weather event. What have I done? I've consumed this, I've done this. The more embedded we are, the more we seem to be related to everything. And the more reflexive we can be about our being within that process. So that's the pillar loop, and in the pillar loop there's bounce back and bouncing back better. In my understanding, everyone understands these things differently. So that's 3 types of resilience in 2 loops. The third loop is another set of coherent languages and ideas. Again, it seems similar to the pillar loop in that we realize we're not separate from the world, we're embedded within these processes, but it's actually the Don loop, where even though we're in that world, it's very difficult for us to find meaning in it and stretch that relationality and loop it around the world so that everything means something to us. In fact, we discover that we're in a world where everything is like too near, enveloping us, that we can't derive the meaning, that there's too much going on everywhere. And we realize that the attempt to find meaning in the smallest thing will continually evade us. We still have to be in that world, and we have to think about resilience in that world. To me, these other ones, it gets more and more exciting for me personally, but that's just me. So there's 2 types of resilience in this third loop. The third loop, so the second loop, the pillar loop, I'm calling it the pillar loop. I'm not saying the pillar would recognize it as a loop or anything to do with it. So in the pillar, I already said in the pillar loop, there's bouncing back and bouncing back better in the same process. In the third loop, in the Don loop, there's maybe we can call the first resilience sensing or pre-eventing. We're not really bouncing back, there's much less separations, but there's a lot of sensing and responding aspirationally in a real-time way. I'm going to explain it.
The Don loop?
Donald Hoffman. Donald Hoffman, day before yesterday. The quantum reality.
Oh, I didn't go to that.
The Netscape, not the Netscape,
No,
the
I wasn't
interface
there.
wars. The interface, the infinity of the wars of the interfaces.
Okay.
It's a different world to the relationality world where everything
Okay.
is meaningful.
I just
for
didn't
us.
get the word, now I got it. Thank
Sorry,
you.
yeah, anyway, so Don's presentation, it was a more technical, scientific-y presentation of interfaces within interfaces within interfaces. I mean, there was no separations, and at the same time, everything was infinitely separated. Like it or not, that's sort of increasingly, for many people, a sort of discourse or a language in which we construct the world and resilience within it. And I was arguing that the first way we did that was through a thing that I'm going to explain, using maybe sensing or pre-eventing, which I'll explain. And then there's another way of seeing resilience, the fifth way within that loop, which is more of a becoming with, hacking, recompositioning, that sort of resilience. So, I know it sounds complicated, but I've got 5 lots of resilience in this particular presentation in 3 sort of loops. Why do I need loops? To my mind, as a sort of model to make it easier for us to maybe discuss how, even though there's a word or there's a concept, it's in a different ontology, a different language, a different imagination of the world, different imagination of the observer and the processes within which that observer might be in, or even what we even mean by observers and processes. There's a lot going on. So it's really a difficult sort of thing. And all concepts and words in our world tend to relate to these things in different ways. I also want to argue, this may or may not be relevant to whatever cybernetics might be. I want to argue in each of these 3 loops, the modernist loop with the separation, the subject-centered loop, where we're inside a process that's meaningful for us, those relations, or the object-centered loop, where we become disappearing into an infinitely unknowing nothingness, the Don loop. I want to argue that within those, there's a coherence of what we mean by those worlds, what we mean by resilience within those worlds, and I want to argue that that meaningfulness goes from a fairly homeostatic, humble appreciation to a more autopoietic, sort of transformative engagement. I don't know why that should be, but I'm just sort of thinking that in the nature of how we formulate models and worlds and our relationship to them, they tend to start off more of an accidental coping-y type way, and then become in our imaginations seem to be more transformative, more progressive, more future-orientated. That's what I think. I don't know why that should be. The third sort of introductory methodological point is that I already said that this sort of nested adaptive cycles of ideas aren't a sort of Hollings one applying to the world literally. I'm going to sort of argue that they're in a sort of superposition with each other. That one person's back loop, the collapse of a framework, is another person's beginning, front loop of another framework. And I don't know why that should be necessarily, but it just feels to me like so intuitively true. So that's the introduction. That's basically what we're going to get, depending on time, questions, that sort of thing.
You're drawing on the screen virtually, and sometimes you may lose the...
I'm thinking if I actually did that, it would just look rubbish. It wouldn't. The circular, loopy thing wouldn't be smooth and nice. It would be shaky and... Yeah. Anyway, there is like a model of an adaptive... No, we have it here. Look, that's a loop. It's just a loop.
It would be. Yeah, the infinity
It's
loop.
an infinity
The Mobius
loop.
strip, some might call it as well.
Yeah, but in fact, actually, that's the Mobius strip. Is sort of what I'm saying. So intuitively has to be true that one person's collapse and implosion and reorganization is another person's. This is the beginning of this new set of ideas. That's why I'm suggesting there might be a superimposition within those things going on. So, but these are really secondary arguments. The superimposition of the loop thing, the idea that things tend to start off in a homeostatic way and then see a more transformative learning engagement. You know, these are just like secondary observations compared to the main thing. I'm just trying to introduce ideas of resilience and what the ethics of those might be according to how I'm thinking about it. So, the first, resilience one, resilience in modernity. We call it, you say modernity, everyone says, what are you talking about? What is modernity, or linearity, or the Enlightenment? A general set of ideas where humans were sort of special and clever, and we could learn and improve and be scientific. The sort of stuff that I think, probably wrongly, that cybernetics is skeptical of. Skeptical of those universalizing and linear assumptions and those separations. I don't know, and I'm not going to talk to you about cybernetics. I know nothing about it. So, my view is that today, the last, whatever today might be, the last 50 years, especially the last 20 to 30 years, whatever modernity might be, whatever confidence there was in progress, has taken a bit of a battering. That whatever resilience might be, is probably the back loop to whatever progress and modernity was. Just in the most general overall view, that we wouldn't need resilience if we could just solve things. There's a problem, what does it matter? We're just going to build back better and all the rest of it. We would never have heard of resilience in this sense. Obviously in its own little box of whatever it used to mean. Before the crisis of modernity, it might have been there. But today it seems that resilience is important to anything that we think about. I work in politics and international relations. You can't do an issue without people saying, yeah, we tried that. We tried to bring democracy, development, security, rights. Those things don't seem to work. Resilience, however, this big bundle of whatever those things weren't, is a sort of way of negotiating how we might do things. So I'm just saying that there seems to be an overarching problem, we'll call it modernity, enlightenment, and resilience seems to be the fill through which people think differently. Maybe in similar ways to some ways in cybernetics, because what was wrong with our previous things We were just generalizing from fairly ignorant data points and extrapolating upwards and onwards forever. We weren't thinking about the context, the multiplicities, the differences, and all those things. Anyway, I'm sure that my time is vaguely limited. So resilience 1 is still a fairly modern resilience. Okay, there's problems in the world. I'm calling it John's resilience. I'm sure he won't recognize it. He'll say, I wouldn't dream of it. So it's not personal and it's not really literally your resilience, but a sort of idea that problems, what problems? Yeah, stuff happens, but we can grow back better. We can learn from it. We can think, yeah, we need to have stronger defenses against hurricanes, flooding, climate change, whatever. We can use all sorts of sciences and technologies, but not just those things. We can be more democratic, more involving, have better conversations. We can design for those conversations to be better, more engaging, so that when we have an opportunity, it will improve. What could be better? I would argue personally that that's, even though it says resilience, and there's many resiliences, that's not really a big, resilience isn't really playing a role in a crisis of modernist thinking. It's improving modernist thinking. It's saying, yeah, well, we just need more democracy, more science, those different things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that's slightly different. So, that's that resilience. Resilience 1, progress resilience. It's still really important that after crises we build back better, we involve people, have those conversations. I'm not saying it's wrong or problematic or anything. Don't get me wrong. So, but I think it's slightly less interesting in terms of process thinking, because it's still quite linear and rational and scientific. So, next we go into the pillar loop. The loop where we begin to realize that we're less separated from the world, that knowledge is less universal. There's less of a God's eye view, less of an observer. We also think at the same time that states have less capacities, or that science has less capacities, or we think the world is more complicated. Things like those things. Now, I would argue that that's like a bouncing back. It's a bouncing back resilience because it's thinking about problems and how we need to think differently about them. It's just the beginning of being inside a process. But what bouncing back begins to tell us is that it's more about us. It's not all about the problem out there, or governments, or scientists and elites. There's something internal. Bouncing back, what I'm calling bouncing back resilience, the first resilience in the pillar loop, the second loop, begins to problematize modernity. That's all I'm sort of saying. It's going to be really crude, very heuristic, don't have that much time. So how does bouncing back start? Let's say I want to give 3 examples of an early sort of secondary loop, the loop where we're all in the same system. Those 3 examples would either be neoliberal economics or neo-institutionalism. They would be Hollings's complex adaptive systems. They might also be how we understand bouncing back from a terrorist attack. These are all ways in which we think about resilience, but we're still quite modernist. In fact, the story of the resilience is, according to my twisted way of thinking, it's a story of how we go from modernity and a confidence in the human subject and in objective science to going out at the other end at the bottom, where it's hubristic to even claim that there's a thinking subject that has a relationship to the world. I would argue that's our resilience journey that we're on in different people, different problems are on in different places. Anyway, so resilience 2 is somehow less confident. How does it work in neoliberal or neo-institutional economics? I don't mean to be rude about neoliberalism or positive about neoliberalism. Just a recognition of pluralities and differences. That when we give certain policies, tax rises, democracy, different things in different parts of the world, they'll work differently according to different contexts, different institutional frameworks, which also work differently in terms of cultural frameworks. That the outcome of something will be non-linear. Non-linear because it's not about the external thing, but about the internal relations of that society, that problematic. Same thing with terrorism. Again, states are less confident. It's not a Hobbesian state that's going to promise to have a democratic contract on securing people. The state will say, the only thing we can promise is that we can't secure you. With terrorist attacks, it's not a matter of if, but of when. Therefore, what we're concerned about is our inner processes. How do we bounce back? How's our citizenry? What are our internal relations? We're beginning to internalize. The same thing with the Hollings systems, the adaptive systems, they're nested, but it's the ones at the bottom that are smaller and quicker and more dynamic. It's more of a bottom-up than a top-down. I would argue we're beginning to think systems at maybe a simple level, but Resilience 1, we're not really thinking systems. And Resilience 2 is beginning to think systems. It's beginning to problematize a certain confidence. In different ways, this is just crude, it's just heuristic. In the real world, all sorts of things are happening differently all of the time. So this is just a very crude thing. Anyway, I would argue that's bouncing back. We want to bounce back after the terrorist attack. A society that's not coping well with the openness to the market, how do we think about those systems to enable them? What are the preconditions to enable societies to have democracy and markets? It's very bouncing back is bouncing back to an equilibrium, bouncing back to a status quo. It's saying, we're pretty good, we're pretty cool, that our linear sciencey stuff isn't really problematized. It's just got problems that we need to think more about. But bouncing back says whatever was before was good. So it's like, even though it's not liberal and universal, it's still fairly liberal. We're still thinking that we're good and cool, that there's still a world, and that humans are still separate from non-humans, all those things. So that's bouncing back. More interestingly, might be Resilience 3, which is in the pillar loop, where we really begin to appreciate what it means to be inside processes.
I would say it's number 4.
That's fine, but when you're presenting, you can give a totally different order.
Comments.
So, you're saying that what I'm saying is number 3 is number 4.
No.
Oh, anyway, look.
Go ahead.
So, all I'm doing now is what I'm calling Resilience 3, bouncing back better. But I want to sort of emphasize, if I can, the methodological, processual view of bouncing back better. Because as John was telling us the other day, we can bounce back better in a modernist view of resilience. There can be a disaster, we can rebuild bigger and better, obviously. Disasters, it's a sort of a blank slate, whatever. So what's different about my bounce back better, Resilience 3, in this more relational, embedded, processual understanding? This is just my view. It's just a heuristic. I'm not advocating it or anything. You know, when we were doing Resilience 2, when we were thinking about processes, the internal aspects of relations and non-linearity, in order to think about bouncing back better, we began to sort of think a system of depth and relations and of emergence. But in those cases, the world was still separated into different assemblages, different time space in the same world. That's how we could bounce back to an equilibrium, because it's the same world and the scientists and the policymakers knew how to adapt to markets and other things. I want to argue that in our relational reflexiveness, we can extend that neoliberal approach to saying, actually, in the world of globalization, interconnectivity, more recently in the world of the Anthropocene, there aren't these separations and divisions. We're going to take what we learned in terms of a bottom-up understanding of relationships and non-linearity, in that responses to things are more to do with the internal systems than to do with things in themselves, and we're going to begin to think about how we can do resilience as adaptation without the accidents. If you're Judith Rodin and the resilient cities that John was doing some work with, I think she calls it the resilience dividend. That once we begin to think relationally and processually, we don't need the disaster, because we've been given a gift of process thinking. That might or might not be the gift of cybernetics, but nevertheless, For all those people who think resilience is brilliant, what they're trying to think about is how do we do resilience without disasters? Why can't we take this wonderful way of thinking, of democratizing, of imagining, and just use it all the time anyway? Because it's clearly much better than what we were doing. What enables them to do that? How does it work? I would argue that this is a generalization of a view of what it means to have a self-reflexive understanding of being or embeddedness. That in globalization, in the Anthropocene, there isn't an outside. This has all sorts of implications. It means we're not having debates about what we should do as actors on a world that's somehow separate. It means that we're always in the world. It means that we're always in processes. We're always in the middle of them. And what's our problem? Our problem has always been that we never even knew there was processes, let alone that we were in the middle of them. We always imagined that we were starting again, de novo, that we could have elections and programs and say, these are our 5-year plans or our 10-year plans, as if we were entirely separate to the world was a passive object. Resilience 3, resilience as bouncing back better, says that things in the world can enable us to govern ourselves better, that we're not the centre of the world. We can take those more humbling processual understandings of resilience to neoliberalism, neo-institutionalism, all those views about bounded subjects, bounded rationalities, and really go with them. What bouncing back better says is that the more sensitive we are to things in the world, the more those effects enable us to reflect upon our own processes. Why? Because we're not separate from them. Before, there was threats that were external to us, and we bounced back. In a world of globalization, interconnectedness, Anthropocene, there's no threats that are separate to us. Threats aren't problems. Threats are messages. Threats are like Gaia knocking on the door saying, you forgot to turn the taps off, or you forgot to think about your energy consumption. It's like problems are us. And if we can see those problems as not external threats to our brilliance and our status quo, but as enabling us to reflect upon what we understand by brilliance and how to govern, we'll govern better. So when there's landslides, disasters or whatever, we don't say, oh, we need to build a bigger wall. We say, no, we realise that we need to think differently about our environment, about our rivers. So resilience 2, bouncing back, and resilience 1 to a certain extent, because it's a secular trend towards a less modernist world, a more complex, less human world. So in resilience 1 and maybe resilience 2, you'd still be building bigger walls against flooding, or you'd still be developing medicine against bacteria. You wouldn't be listening to the messages. It would be as if that's got nothing to do with us. These new viruses, this flooding, whatever it is, this extreme weather. Oh no, we're just going to build bigger walls. Build bigger walls, bigger flooding, bigger diseases. This is the way of understanding what it's like to be living inside a process, in the middle of processes. In the middle of processes with no outside. No sort of, maybe no observer. I don't know. I'll leave the cybernetics, hopefully, to you to help me out with. I'm sure there is a cybernetic relevance. Anyway, so in that world of self-reflexivity, inside an embedded set of relationships, which I'm calling the pillar world, which may or may not be, the more we learn to be affected, the more sensitive we are to the world, the more we can reflect upon our own governance. The more we realise that when we're eating this chocolate bar, drinking this coffee, using this pen, that has implications for human rights, for global warming, for other things, the more connected we are. The more we can see that extreme weather events are related to how we organise, how we consume, how we have discussions about policy making. Nothing in the more we learn to be affected, the more we learn to sensitise ourselves in a world which is one system of interrelations, the more we learn about our own governance. So this is why it's a different loop to the first loop. The first loop of modernity is we're learning all the time. We're separating ourselves from the world through our knowledge and our sciences. This second loop, we're becoming embedded in the world. We're learning from the world, but not in a modernist science way. We're learning about ourselves, our relationships, our processes. And it's those processes, those relationships that are key, not the entities or the objects. The more we see those things as entities and objects, the more they're just natural objects, would be the argument. So, that's the end of the pillar loop. The loop of from modernity to a subject-centered world. And I sort of argue that resilience plays a cruel trick on us. It sort of takes away modernity, but first of all it does it in a nice way, where the human subject is still at the centre of the world. We can just reflect. In fact, it's even better, because we can change the world by just reflecting on what we're already doing, the relations we're already embedded in. We don't even have to go somewhere to change the world, to fight in the Spanish Civil War or whatever. We just have to reflect on our beingness. This is not a normative presentation, it's just how resilience and processes and observations relate to each other, in my understanding. So, the more complicated thing maybe are the next two resiliences. I'm arguing that they fit in a different loop of discursive frameworks of subjects and the world. And I want to argue that this loop leads to an object-centeredness. The human isn't the centre of the world. And I think it's based on an understanding that phenomenologically humans are pretty crap. That we can hardly see, we can hardly smell or taste. And even though we think we're reasoning subjects, we can't even have a decent discussion because all of us are so bounded and limited that we can't even see that what we think is democratic and clever and like the highest point of rationality is idiotic, if you know what I mean. This is what people would argue, that we don't have enough, even though we're trying to learn to be affected by things in the world, we can't really see most of them. We can't see them ontologically and epistemologically, that we need help, is what people would argue. If we really live in a world where we're related and there's processes, it's a little bit hubristic to assume that we, as a small fraction of that world, with a particular way of being in it and seeing it, are going to be able to properly engage. So, I'm thinking, one way of thinking about this extension towards thinking of objects rather than subjects is through affordances. One way of thinking, just saying. So, in Resilience 3, we were thinking of the affordances of things in the world, appearances in the world, for us and our ability to reflect upon our own ways of governing. So that was the affordance of things for us. That the more we paid attention to them, the more we could think about our own governing. Still quite modernist, quite subject-centered. I'm arguing that Resilience 4 says actually we need to do a lot more. There's millions and billions of things in the world. They're all thinging with other things. Things have loads of affordances for things. We need to tap into this whole other world of conversations, this whole other world of affordances, this whole other world of communications and meanings. Sounds a bit hippy-dippy maybe, because we're missing out on all of these conversations. How does it work? I think it works through correlations, not causations. Up until this point of Resilience 3, we've still been doing a fairly modernist causal world. Even though we brought in non-linearity, so many different multiple ways of thinking causation, but still fairly modernist. I would argue a world of big data, the world of the Internet of Things, to make it more real for us, is going further into a non-modernist world, and it's working on the basis of correlations. Correlations, i.e. how non-humans have affordances for other non-humans, how things have affordances for things, how we extend our abilities to sense and to be affected, how we extend our abilities to have and see affordances. How does that work? Okay, so one example is the canary in the coal mine, which is an easy example. So what's the canary doing in the coal mine, and how is it working on correlation rather than causation? Obviously, when we say that causation isn't key, whoever we are, People aren't saying that there isn't causation in the world. They're just saying that causation isn't really enough to be doing things. There's also correlation. Anyway, you're in a coal mine, there's poisonous gases, you're miners, I guess, mining in the coal mine, and you have a canary, and the canary dies. So there's causation. The poisonous gases have affected the canary, and the canary has died. Why is that? Because the canary has affordances for the poisonous gases. The miners can't see anything, and they're still healthy. The canary is dead. The canary is sensing things that other people couldn't sense. The canary's ability to sense can be correlated with the existence of the poisonous gases. In doing that, you then leave the coal mine when the canary dies. So what have you done? You haven't developed your causal knowledge. You know about poisonous gases. You haven't solved a problem or anything, but you've seen something that you couldn't see. You could see a process of emergence that before it was like fine or everyone was dead. The canary has mediated that process of emergence, made it more fine-toothed, fine-grained. The canary's affordances has extended us. It's been like a prosthetic ability of sensing. So we realized already in Resilience 3 that our ability to sense and have affordances was key in our processual being in a world, that we're already in the middle of everything. In Resilience 4, all we're really doing is extending those prosthetic abilities to see processes in their emergence, moving further and further away from the modernist world of separate entities. You know, healthy, unhealthy, peace, war, all the rest of it. How else do we use correlations? As everyone knows, we also use all this social media, all this like data that we're shedding from our phones, everything else. I would argue the real interesting thing for many people about those things is not a causal knowledge, but a correlational knowledge. Obviously, to have correlational knowledge, we need to know how to do correlations. There's no point making a compass if you're not correlating magnetic north with north. There's no point having a thermometer unless you know the causal qualities of heat and mercury. But still, you're using a correlational machine to sense differences in temperature and enable you to navigate. These are all correlational. Anyway, so you have like something basic like Google search terms. You're all familiar with the Google search terms flu relationship thing. Google says we can see flu in its emergence before the doctors and everything from people searching for cough, sore throat, that sort of thing. Google aren't saying we're not having a causal relationship. We're not doing modernist prediction and of extrapolating of data. We're saying through the correlation of those search terms, we can see something in more real time, enabling more responses to it. Just saying that, just the logic of how it works in a processual world. We need to be aware of processes. That's all. And so correlation is magic for that, because in a more processual world, causation sort of begins to flatten out and blur because it's all relational and processual anyway, I guess. Anyway, so as we know, the Google flu trends thing, that didn't work. But why didn't it work? Interestingly, it wasn't a modernist failure. It didn't not work because the facts were wrong, because there aren't any facts like that separate to the world. It worked because the correlations were wrong, because actually those searches didn't correlate at that time in that place with that certain thing. How do you work on improving correlations in real time? Through like big data, algorithmic stuff. The algorithms aren't literally governing, and they're not literally learning literal modernist things. They're thinking about correlations. How does the pixels in the drone picture relate to refugees or housing? It's correlational vision. Anyway. So the imagination in terms of resilience is that the more we can see processes in their emergence, we can pre-events. It's like work not to change ourselves adaptively, but by seeing things, we can manage them. We're not solving them, we're not preventing them, we're not responding afterwards, but the thing becomes spread out. A bit like the fly, and you're trying to swat the fly, you're being as instinctive and quick as you can. The fly has a different spatial temporal thing, all the time-space stuff that Don was talking about. So for the fly, he's not preventing you or responding afterwards. It's like, hey, I see the reverberations of that thing, I'm actually forced to move out of the way practically. So if you could see things in their emergence through their reverberations, they wouldn't actually exist in modernist ways. So say my international relations stuff, we have conflict, and before we used to have post-conflict, or how do you respond after genocides, then we try to do how do you prevent things, I don't know, better education at school, design better conversations or something. Then people said, actually, conflicts, just like avalanches or anything else, are processes. They start with two people disagreeing, or someone saying, I don't think that's right, or I think they're coming over the border, or they're going to take our land, or there's this dispute or that dispute. Conflicts aren't nothing anymore. It's like an immediate thing that just appears, like an entity. It's very difficult to talk about pre-conflict, post-conflict, or conflict peace. How is that? Because we understand there's conflict all the time, everywhere in the world, and sometimes conflict isn't noticed and it grows and grows. This is the imaginary, this is the understanding of it. What people say is, if we saw conflict through Twitter or Facebook, if we had a little algorithmic bot that detected certain words that we've correlated that we think are important, I don't know, mention of rights or borders or different ethnic groups, we could then respond, either with another a Twitter message of don't do that, or this is the case, or send a policeman around to lock someone up. The point is about how you might modulate things, like a Deleuzian society of control modulation, that there's always sickness, health, conflict, non-conflict. Our problem has been our modernist inability to see them all as like in superposition, that they're always everything there all the time, and our inability to see things has meant that we couldn't even, when we thought we were governing and being clever and having all that knowledge, it's really stupid. Anyway, so this is like the sensing, pre-eventing, the imagination being, and this is homeostatic, of course, because nothing could ever really happen in the world if everything was being modulated immediately. You know, you'd be a quantified self, we wouldn't even have diseases or something, because the imagination, your temperature goes up, you sleep 1 minute less, who knows what, and you're like responding to it. Not like the modernist world where there's certain diseases like this over there and they have certain universal effects. You can imagine the disintegration, time and space of this imagination. Anyway, for many people this would be resilience, of course. Totally self-knowing, self-governing, processual beingness in the world. However, there's no human subject, there's no thinking separation in the imagination, obviously. People have to make the machines and do all the things and all the rest of it. I'm just saying in the imagination. Anyway, that's just resilience 4 in this loop object, towards the object loop, and it's quite homeostatic. Resilience 5, which is the last one, is saying, well, this is too homeostatic and boring, but we really like the idea of getting rid of the human subject. Why can't we see ourselves continue in a process, in the war of interfaces, which goes all the way down, where we're thinking about our affordances for others. In Resilience 4, the sensing one, it's really about the affordances of things for each other, how we see through seeing of seeing. Maybe that's cybernetically, how the observer observes. I think there must be a connection, the infinite recursion of sensing and seeing, and not really about thinking. I think that all of these versions of resilience have some connection with cybernetic approaches, I think, but I don't know. And anyway, so the final one would be more of a sympoetic recompositioning of the world, where we're thinking about our affordances for things. How do we enable the piano to become more piano-y? How, when we cook, do we enable the food to, become what it wants to be? How do we live in a world where we're thinking about the affordances of us for things, where we really submerge ourselves into the world? We don't think, how do we develop the science of cooking, or how do we develop how to play the piano? It's always the opposite way of thinking. Now, we can argue, of course, it's like a hubristic imaginary and all the rest of it. We're not really doing it. I'm just trying to say the imaginary, the discourse, the language of how we think resilience processually in the world. The fifth and final one is where the world is a playground, where the world is a great outdoors of invitation where everything is always different, always new, and the only thing holding us back from enabling the unfolding of the process of the world is our modernist heads and our modernist separations. So people would argue that if only we could become less human, become more childlike, more animal, more other, more non-human, we could actually enjoy our beingness in the world with love and affirmation, rather than having this terrible, twisted negativity to the world that we used to call modernity. So anyway, those are 5 ideas of resilience in 3 sort of modes of thinking about them. And all I'm really saying is maybe that might be useful for you thinking about cybernetics and how it might be relevant today. Maybe it wouldn't be useful. Who can tell? I don't know. Anyway, that's that. Thank you.
I think my initial reaction is I really like your conception. Just feels a little bit like the 5 are separate in the way you present it. That may not be what you mean. But I felt like the 5 are all connected and they're all part of the same thing, really. And you need all of them all the time. But some of them you need more at certain times than you do others to think about. The last one felt to me like the surfer. I showed the picture of the surfer's part. He's enjoying what he's doing. He's taking, he isn't in control, but he's using the energy of that wave to enjoy his life and have a thriving life, but he's not in control.
So,
Not a question,
we seem to
just
be doing
a
like question
statement.
and answer. So, I think we could see all of them all together. My personal view, maybe wrongly, is that I think it's really important to draw out the decline of modernist ontologies, because otherwise we're just going to have a different view of the world and be different in the world without even having noticed it or having had a discussion. It would just be immoral to think of, why can't we do this? Why can't we act over and against the world? People would just be saying, how can you even think like that? You know,
Except the tension
jump
between
in.
the two.
So I think all of those 5 exist because they're all in the world that we live in. But for me, for some reason, it's important to tell a story of transformation. I don't know why. Sorry, you were next, and then Kant.
I want to basically follow up on what John said. You closed with something that almost sounded like a mutually exclusive choice between those 5 levels, and that's where
3 levels. 3 levels? 5 levels? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I think context matters a lot in terms of which of these is the most viable option. So, for example, I hate cars, but I think the car is a fantastic invention. Our tendency to do too much of a fantastic thing kills it. It's the same with science. I think the idea of a scientific experiment is brilliant, but if the whole world becomes dominated by that paradigm, then there is an issue. So it's not a mutually exclusive thing, it's a contextual, what's the right approach? And I can see myself fighting shoulder to soldier with Descartes for rationalism and reductionism in a world where people get burned for witchcraft. Yeah, and I see a little bit of each of these levels in each of the other one. It's a little bit like an Indra's net kind of thing, because in order to have Google predict flu patterns, you need to go from a world without Google to a world that has Google, which is a progressive thing, just as an example. But what now happens is that different ones of us operate at different levels, and we get into each other's ways, and we misunderstand each other. And what does that mean? For example, I'm really happy that you brought in the playground, which is where design happens, and which is where many of us work. I'm thinking about that moment when the first miner showed up with a cannery. And what did those colleagues think? Why do you bring that? Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe the neighboring village, they tried cucumbers and flamingos, and I'm going with a, yeah. How, that moment, yeah, where does that come from? And that social dynamic of, do we allow each other to operate at that level, or do we keep each other from operating at that level? That seems to be the real kicker.
So, maybe. But for me, I think there's two issues that I have. And I'm not sure if we can really choose between these resiliences. I sort of think that they're very much like world views, and I'm probably wrong, but to me, they're a little bit like separate discursive frameworks. The world and ourselves within it seem a little bit different. And worst of all, they seem to be superimposed. They seem to be like overdetermined. It just seems really difficult to have a traditional modernist view of resilience with its confidences. Is this a bit like the Anthropocene? For many people, it could be interpreted as a modernist thing. We can now do Spaceship Earth. And for other people, it's like, so to me, these things are sort of subjective. They're not to do, which is where I think cybernetics might be important. But even though they're subjective, it doesn't mean that we can just choose. Because subjectivity is shaped by the context and the worlds in which we live in. So that's why I sort of think that conversations don't enable us to make different choices necessarily, because there's a world outside of those conversations. So I find it, and intellectually, philosophically today, the interesting work is being done in the later bits of resilience rather than the first bit. There's no reason for that. There's no reason in the world for object-oriented ontology and speculative realism and all those things to be more trendy or have more life. But that's the sort of case. So my first point is, I agree with you that you don't have to do any of these separations in these ways. They can all be there at the same time. On the other hand, I don't think that they're choices. And secondly, and maybe this is the same point, is I don't think you can say what a right approach would be, because the right approach is also it is the same thing, the contextual. So I'm like a Marxist, for what it's worth, or what it means, but it doesn't make sense for me to have a Marxist critique of resilience and say it's just about capitalism and class power. I mean, I don't think that would be wrong. It just wouldn't be interesting, or it wouldn't be relevant. It would be boring for me. And like, it just wouldn't sound right. At a different moment or a different meeting I probably wouldn't go to, it would be like, yeah, we all like the sound of that. Yeah, of course, resilience is capitalist and neoliberal, and, So I just think that even though I agree entirely that these are subjective, contingent ways of seeing and passing the world, that doesn't mean that there isn't something very real and very sort of powerful and determining about the way that those things are constructed and shaped, I think. Candy.
Maybe just a short addition to this, because I quite agree with what was just been said before. Are you really just talking about a notion of resilience? I think you're talking about something much bigger. You're talking about positioning us within the world and the way we relate to the world, and that's got to do with who we are and how we define our way of interacting with it. And I think this resilience topic is good to go into that, but I think resilience 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doesn't, it's quite small compared to the overarching theme.
Maybe you're right. Maybe there is a bleeding of the whole world into a discussion of different ways of thinking about resilience.
It makes it more graspable.
So, yeah, I mean,
Is that what you said?
but I think there are debates within. I think it's true what you say, and maybe for heuristic reasons, it's exaggerated in my presentation, I would go with that, because I think the job of an academic is to exaggerate in order to clarify or at least construct what forms in which things might be clarified. So, Scott and then Pilar.
It struck me that all of these loops are bottom up. I'd like to see a bit more thinking about the fractal aspects, the fact that I'm an individual, I'm also a colony of mostly bacteria. I'm a member of my family, of my profession, if you're Marxist, of a class. To me, you also have to be aware of your obligations to this larger entity, and that the two natural entities that we're all part of, the whole of life and all of intelligent life. And what are those obligations that we have to these largest entities, and how do those constrain our individual actions and the decisions we make and the conversations we have?
True. I take a way of seeing us in a fractalizing way. I'm not sure. I was just sort of saying, but I was saying different ways of thinking about resilience. So I'm not. If you notice, none of those resiliences was a complexity theory or a fractalizing approach, which I would have put in the modernity or modernist framework. That's like a sciencey thing. I don't often get a lot of discussions around resilience and complexity theory because it's so modernist.
Well, just forget fractal, just think of the context. The different contexts that we identify with. Again, individual, family, organization, whatever organization, and what's beyond that. And we're trying to, going back to that Carl Sagan quoted in the movie Contact, we're trying to really be efficient on all these different levels, or answer who we are on a lot of different levels. It's almost beyond our capacity to think through those, just because of the limitations of our minds. But aren't there some overall rules or norms, and are they the right ones? And give us some thought to which ones are right and which ones are wrong.
Yeah. So, I get you. So you're working within the subject-centered pillar, how we can be reflecting on the affordances for us framework, and how that would work at different levels, where we're embedded, maybe as you say, on a sort of fractal scalar way, all the way from us to the world. And how do we think about all those things? That's difficult, which is why maybe one of the reasons why the subject-centered framework of resilience, where we are the world, and still the problems of the world remain or get worse, has many limitations for people in different ways that I haven't had time to go into. Whereas the more of the object-orientated world, we can never go wrong. And we're always discovering our duties or responsibilities or our ethical thing in the world. It's the object that's calling us. And if the object doesn't call us adequately, that's not our fault. If you know what I mean.
If you have the wrong set of these ethical norms and rules, your group eventually is going to get into trouble, because you're going to be accumulating mistakes, and you're going to end up with a catastrophe back to the lives.
Maybe, but one person's catastrophe is another person's opportunity. So I take your, so there's I tried to explain this different world, that's why the different world views are important, because it's the questions that we ask, I personally think, have to be in those three those three sort of loopy things that I did, they're different ontologies. They enable different questions. You can't have those personal responsibilities in the top or the bottom one. I'm not saying that that's better or bad or wrong. I'm just saying that I think resilience does, and questions of resilience opens up fairly major philosophical questions of who we are and what worlds do we live in. But I think time is...
Don't keep going for a little bit. This is good. Unless you're tired.
Okay, I've got no, because some people have been waiting a long time for questions.
Yes.
I know, Scott, why don't you come back if there's a gap? Pilar, and then...
I don't have to shorten mine because I could go on. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness.
Is there a microphone that people can use because it's all loud and all outside?
I find that there's more better application than I could have imagined of the Holling loop. There was always in the back loop it was meant to be the recovery and the method of recovery. And what you then added to this, that there's an epistemological change, an ontological and epistemological change. Changes the method of recovery so that the forward loop starts being qualitatively different and leads us to different kinds of perceptions, behaviors, and actions. And perhaps that third loop is what I tried to get to, but had inadequate vocabulary for, was a double look, which incorporates both the first and the second, as well as the affordances concept, because that is where you overcome the sense of total despair because you cannot see everything, because you begin to depend on that which you cannot see by its repercussions to what you can see, as even as the musicians told me that they couldn't see it all. So maybe the whole thing has to do with both broadening or narrowed. If I had a diagram, the language became a narrow perception, broadening the language, broadening the culture, such that we accept the systemic and incorporate it. Perhaps the second one should be called a postmodernist, and the third one an integrative.
Yep.
And I want to talk more, but time for others.
Yeah, so my comment is, or comment question, is less about the loops, and I understand the point of talking about them ontologically as separate entities, and I too would argue that they're interconnected. But for me, it's more so once you identify something that, let's say, is unmanageable, it is too much to digest. It is unmanageable. How do you personally go about altering the framework so it can become manageable and you can act on it, or do you just accept something to be unmanageable? And that kind of level of, because a lot of what you talked about seems to me unmanageable at a certain scope.
Me personally, I don't know. I don't really have an interest in these things personally. But I guess it depends what it is. I mean, it is unmanageable. Oh, I don't know, like the finitude of life. That's unmanageable, surely, you might argue in a context. How can we cope with knowing that we were going to die? Other people would say, oh, actually, that's the whole way of managing it, because the unmanageability of it actually creates the framework in which to manage. So I'm not really sure what literally an unmanageable thing could be.
Well, I mean, you could say the internet is, to a degree, like Randolph talks about the internet as being, to a degree, unmanageable because of its complexity. And I'm just kind of, some of what you talk about, it seems like there's a resilience to do, or there's a certain optimism with the way you frame resilience. And I just kind of wonder about these constraints and limitations, and how that really works, and how you create frameworks that can actually be digestible in a more epistemological way. Because you can't do everything. I don't know that we can completely adapt for everything. I think there's,
I think you're right. And I sort of think that resilience, as I already sort of said at the beginning, is like a coming to terms with the end of modernity, coming to terms with the end of a narrative of managing and knowing and controlling. And that's how resilience sort of eats modernist assumptions and spits out happy clappy affirmation. Yeah, everything's uncontrollable, and that's what's so wonderful about the world. That's what resilience does, and we bring in resilience into our world to do that for us, rightly or wrongly, because what we find unmanageable is the aspirations of modernity and its legacy that bequeaths to us to improve things and to transform things and to know things better. And it seems to us that the world is telling us that we can't live up to those expectations, that there was something either wrong with those expectations or with the world and all those other things. And so resilience increasingly makes us at home in the world. That's why I'm sort of saying about going from a homeostatic to an autopoietic. But as we become more at home in a world where the human doesn't exist, it becomes wonderful. It's like a playground. Everything is amazing. It's like a Lego movie where everything is awesome all the time, awesomely. And it's real. It really, really is. The end of modernity is increasingly awesome for us in the same way as the birth of modernity was probably awesome for Wordsworth or whoever it was, if you know what I mean. The imaginary of being at one with the world, that doesn't happen very often, as far as I can see. So I'm not advocating resilience. I'm trying to understand how it works and how its loops loop for us. Yes.
You've presented these 3, 4, 5 resiliences as succession, historical succession, among other things, each of which I would assume either supersedes or subsumes the previous or accommodates a world in which people are thinking and operating based on the predecessor. You choose to start Resilience 1 with modernist thinking. I mean, when the world is, you could say, becomes a conscious project of human beings. A lot of the discourse of resilience, though, actually refers to imagined or real pre-modern ways of engaging the world. That why can't we have adaptive adaptive relations with the world like we did in pre-modern times? Why? So I guess my question is that then resilience -1, -2, -3, or is resilience for you? Does resilience, by your definition, only emerge when it becomes a conscious component that then structures our conscious interaction with the world as a project? It's maybe just a matter of asking for your definition why the 0 hour for resilience for you is at modernism.
So, good question. So first of all, I think resilience has a long history as a word. I think people pick it up from Latin or Greek or who knows what. So I start resilience from the point that I did, I guess, as a way of saying resilience as a concept that was increasingly relevant to how we see ourselves in the world, how we govern it and know it. Maybe you could argue that was arbitrary, in the same way as modernity's always had criticisms of modernity, since whenever we might start it from. But I sort of think, if we were doing a word search for resilience, someone did it. It's like just like the Anthropocene. Every chart today has the similar thing. It's all like rockets up right at the end. And that's why I was only interested in resilience as in that rocketing up at the end. And as I was saying, if resilience can be conceptualized as the back loop of after the crisis of modernity, in the same way as the Anthropocene or anything else could be seen like that, then it would have certain associations with non-modern thinking, because the one thing that resilience might be, and the journey of resiliences might be, is a sort of eating away of modernist assumptions and separations. And so for many people, in non-modern thought, however we might conceptualize that, provides really powerful counters to that. You know, what is modernity? The separation of humans from non-humans. well, what's like pre-modern thought, or non-modern thought, or indigenous thought, or Creole thought, or who knows what, or ways of being
I
as
think
well.
that's exactly to my point. But essentially, you've in your history, your narrative of resilience, you start with modernity.
Yeah. Because resilience, the importance of becoming Creole, or becoming indigenous, or becoming other, or becoming animal, is after modernity. The importance of becoming neoliberal is, liberalism was necessarily before becoming neoliberal. That's just the way that it is. And so our imagination of what we might become after the end of a future in a modernist world, we draw on those things, really importantly. And we transform them at the same time as we draw on them, I'm guessing. Yeah. Last question? No?
Sure.
Yeah?
I was just, sort of in the same way, you can say, let's start with resilience and just get rid of that. It seems like eventually that's a concept that you're not going to. And
Yeah.
when you're at the point where, when you're at the point where one is happily surfing,
Yeah, once the nightmare of modernity is over,
well, but there's
what
been
was
a nightmare.
resilience?
There's been a nightmare associated with that, with the same concepts before modernity, and there will be after. And it doesn't seem like resilience is quite an adequate concept to deal with whatever you're talking about as post-modernist, because the ethical implications of the surfing position are just too vast to consider. And it seems like that seems like surfing over the surface of the huge amount of suffering that's underneath for the large number of people. And when you say, oh, you can deal with the problem of mortality by kind of just happily embracing it, you can also happily deal with the problem of the suffering of the many beings of the world by surfing over it and ignoring it.
So I really agree. So I'm not advocating these things, but it seems to me that that's the world we live in, because without a political view of the possibilities of transforming our world, what do we do with the suffering of the world, apart from see it in other ways that may be more affirming? So, Candy.
I was just about to say there's whole branches of religion that deal with this, and I would say that we could all be better off if we just get along with it and reject it for what it is and try to empty our minds of this conception. And in ancient Chinese philosophy as well, there's this concept of wu wei. It means no intention. The interesting thing is that foreigners always think that it means having the attention of no intention. But actually means this surfing process. It is meaning being one with the world and becoming a child and just moving with it instead of doing nothing or forcefully doing anything. However, this is in many cases, and these can be isolated, constructed relationships, and as soon as there's other relationships, other intentions coming into it, then I'm not so sure how long they can remain. So I'm not sure whether you think that there necessarily needs to be agreement on this happy surfing state of being among everything and anything involved in that.
I agree, but I'm just sort of saying that seems to me to be, as far as I can see it, the logical endpoint of a certain rise and fall of the human in a world as process. For many people, it's totally solipsistic and untenable. But who knows what solipsistic and untenable ideas become fashionable? I don't know. Final questions, John.
I think my final comment is probably, I found this philosophical discussion very interesting, but I got to thinking about one particular thing that that you said, which was we're not separate from our threats, but rather they are messages for new opportunities. Or at least that's what I wrote down. It's sort of idea, and I got to thinking about Dave Snowden's Kennethian model, if you're familiar with that. And on one side, you've got complicated and simple, which are really in the controllable world, you might say, where you behave and cause and effect at work. And on the other side, we've got complex and chaotic, where the world you're talking about, maybe that's the world we're in now, has become so complex that sensing and then going with the flow rather than trying to figure out and control it is the reason why this is an important question in how we behave. But I think the reality we live in probably goes back to my initial comment, which is at times in any given day or any point in our week, we're in different parts of that space. Sometimes we're in the simple spot. I get up in the morning, my feet push, and it gets me out of bed. I go brush my teeth. And it's not complex. And there are complicated problems I can solve, but others have to get somebody else's advice because they're too complicated for me. But if I take that action, cause and effect works. But there are other times when it absolutely doesn't work, and sensing and just trying to get the flow and to move with what's going on is really what I have to do because I just can't figure it out. And so I think for practical application of what we're talking about, we've got to have some capability for moving from one state to another. But philosophically going forward, I like the surfing metaphor.
Cool. I think that's a good point to say. Sorry, one final point. Final point.
Not exactly a question, but this has resonance for me with the derivation of the word cybernetics, which is the person who's got the hand on the tiller, who's steering, doesn't need to know why the wind and the tide is doing what it's doing, but is essentially tacking, using the forces rather than fighting them and figuring out how to get where they have to go.
Right.
I knew it had something to do with cybernetics. So, thank you very much. Thank you.